So, I've heard some of you have started to bake, which is awesome, but you've decided to try your hand at sourdough and you're finding it soul-crushingly difficult. I hope I can help. Sourdough is difficult because it's a high hydration dough, and as such it's difficult to handle. The written recipes do a fairly poor job of describing how to handle the dough, what the dough should feel like, and what it should look like at any stage along the way. Now, I'm a purist about sourdough, but in the interest of getting more of you up and running, I'm going to simplify this a little bit. I'm going to leave out the pre-ferment and the auto-lease steps. If you've never heard of these, don't worry about it. They're advanced techniques that can make your dough that much better, but only that much. You can return to these techniques when you want to level up. You will need some equipment. Some of these things are optional and some of them are mandatory. The first thing you're going to need is a scale that reads in grams, no exceptions. You're also going to need a mixing bowl of some kind. I use this 2-quart Cambro tub. It's about the right size for the recipe that we're going to make today. And you're going to need a wooden spoon. These are things that are going to be helpful. A dough knife or bench scraper will help you handle the high hydration dough and scrape it off the bench when it gets stuck. This one I made. This one is from OXO. They're both quite helpful. A thermometer of some kind to measure the water temperature, a whisk to mix the water with the starter, and you're going to need something to score the dough with. This is a lom. It's a razor blade on a plastic handle. This is a substitute. It is a razor blade on a bamboo skewer. This is not for the faint of heart. You have to handle and bend over a double-edged razor blade, but this is actually quite useful. You could also use a kitchen knife here, but it has to be sharp. Really, a razor blade is the right tool for this. Finally, you're going to need a heavy cast iron pan to cook the bread in. This is typically done in a Dutch oven of some kind. This is a Le Creuset 4-quart. It's a good size for this particular recipe, but it's fairly expensive. What I much prefer is this Lodge combo cooker, which has an advantage over the Le Creuset of being 1 part skillet and 1 part saucepan. What this allows you to do is cook the bread in the skillet part with the saucepan as the lid, and that makes it easier to get the dough into the pan when it's very hot, and it also allows you to score the bread more easily. All around, it's a better choice for cooking bread. Okay, so let's start with the starter. The starter is the backbone of sourdough bread, and this starter has peaked already. It has started to fall. That's okay, we can still bake with it. Ideally, you would want to bake with your starter around the time that it peaks, but this one is still full of bubbles. It's nice and tangy. You can taste it. Yep, sure enough, nice and tangy. And we're going to need about 100 grams of this. So I'm going to go ahead and stir this down. I want the starter to be homogeneous. You should be able to see the bubbles popping and hear them as you stir it down. And you just want to get that all mixed up so that it is relatively even throughout. Now we measure. I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to zero it to make sure. I'm measuring in grams here, always. And I'm going to add about 100 grams. This can be, doesn't have to be super exact with the starter. A little more, a little less is not going to change much. There, 100, right on the nose. Okay, so on to the water. I'm going to add 400 grams of warm filtered water. Filtered because the chlorine in water tends to inhibit the yeast. The yeast is not very strong with sourdough, and you really don't want to use tap water. The warmth of the water, it's 80 degrees. You can use regular plain room temperature water, that's fine. Depending on the temperature of your kitchen, you're going to want to add some warmth to that to move the process along faster. If it's a really warm day, you can use cold water or room temperature water, and that's going to slow the process down, which might be desirable. Today, we'll just go ahead and use 80-degree water. So I'm going to zero out the scale, and I'm going to slowly pour it in. And this is something that I want to be relatively exact about. And 401.5. Okay, well, I went over a little bit, but we'll go with it. I can turn off the scale, and now we're just going to whisk this together to mix these so that it blends more easily with the flour. All right, so now we go back on the scale. The scale is zeroed again, and we're going to add the flour. This will be 500 grams of flour, which is enough for my standard size loaf, and it's a nice easy number to deal with. We'll go ahead and start adding this flour, and again, we want to be relatively close to the mark. This is bread flour, by the way. You can use AP flour, but bread flour will have better gluten development, slightly better gluten development. You can also add whole wheat in some proportion, say 100 grams to 400 grams of white. I'm going to make it all with white today. And I went over a bit, 509, but that's okay. I can just scoop a little off the top. You could also mise en place this and have everything ready and measured ahead of time. Okay, 500 grams. That's good. We'll zero the scale. And now the salt. I greatly prefer kosher salt. This is diamond crystal salt, and we need about 12 grams of it. That's on the salty side. Some people would say 10 grams. I like it with a little more salt. You can find your own level. And there we go, 12 grams. All right, so now we have all the ingredients together. We can turn off the scale and set it aside. And now we're just going to do the initial mix. This is going to get messy. And it starts to integrate. There's still some pockets of wet and some pockets of dry flour. And we just want to get as much of this done with the spoon as we can. Okay, so that's as much as that's going to happen. Now we're going to have to use our hands. So for this, I like to keep a little bowl of water near the dough to wet my hands in. It really makes it so that the dough doesn't stick as much to your hands, but it is still gonna, especially at this point, it's gonna stick to your hands somewhat. So I'll just get my hand wet, and I'm just gonna go through here and go into the corners and try and get any of the dry flour dislodged, and I'm just gonna squeeze this a few times with my hands. I'm gonna try and turn it over a few times, just looking for any pockets that aren't well integrated. And that's good. And of course, some still ends up on your hand. We're gonna let this sit for 30 minutes, and then we're gonna come back and do the first turn. So I'll see you in a few. All right. So it's been 30 minutes, and we're going to do our first turn of the dough. Now this is what substitutes for kneading the dough. We're not going to actually knead it in the traditional sense. We're going to do what's called a turn, and we do this every 30 minutes for about 3 to 4 hours during the course of the dough development. Okay, so here we have the same shaggy lump that we left it with 30 minutes ago, and we're just going to get our hand wet. And the goal here is to get the dough more elastic and smooth. And that's going to happen not all at once. It's going to happen kind of over the course of many of these 30-minute cycles. We'll try and demonstrate that. Okay, so I'm going to wet my hand, and I'm going to grab a corner, and I'm just going to lift some up. And at this early phase, this is going to be really messy, and it's going to tear some, and don't worry about it. You just want to get some basic stretching done here, and by the time we finish this cycle, you will see that the dough is already smoother. So we grab some, we fold it over. We're not trying to stretch too far. We're just trying to kind of get the dough into a better form. And I'm going to wet my other hand too and get both of these hands in here. Fold that, and you can see already that the dough is becoming smoother and less shaggy. I'm not going to worry too much about the little bits that are still stuck to the tub. And as I do this, what's happening is that the dough is tightening up, and the dough will eventually start to fight you the more you do this. And that's your clue that you've done enough. I can already feel it getting stiffer. I can see that it's getting smoother. And in this early phase, I can be fairly aggressive with it because it hasn't risen much and the dough is not delicate yet. So I'm having a hard time actually sticking it to itself here. It will still fold, but it's definitely resisting. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and grab one final corner, and I'm just going to try and lift it up from the bottom, and this is going to be messy, and flip it over and leave it. And now we will come back in 30 minutes and do this again. See you then. All right, it's been 30 minutes. We are now at the 1 hour mark since we first combined our ingredients, and we're going to do another turn. I'm going to wet my hand. I'm going to wet both hands, and I'm going to grab a corner, and I can still be fairly aggressive, and I can stretch the dough a little bit more on this turn because it's got a little bit more elasticity, and I'm just going to keep doing this until the dough fights me. And this doesn't take very long, maybe a minute total. Maybe not even that. The dough is already fighting me. I can feel it resisting. And I now see the dough is getting nice and tight. I flip the ball over, and there we have it. We will see you again in 30 minutes and do it again. Back again. It's been 30 minutes. We are at the 1.5 hour mark since we first combined our ingredients. Open up our bin and look at our lovely ball of dough. Wet our hands, and we're going to do the same thing again. Grab a corner, push it back, fold it over, rotate, grab a corner, grab a corner, grab a corner. This process is called stretch and fold, by the way. We're stretching and we're folding. The dough is fighting me. It's also getting a little bit poofier. It has had a chance to rise. And it's actually really difficult now already. Folds are becoming less successful. I'm going to flip it over. And we now have a much smoother ball than we did when we started. This will take on the form of the tub and spread out, but that's okay. Eventually, it will be a tight ball. And we always cover it between turns. All right, back again. It's been 30 minutes, and we are at the 2 hour mark since we combined our ingredients. Let's take a look. The dough has spread out to take the shape of the tub. That's okay. We're going to wet our hands, royal we, and we're going to do the same thing again. Now I can feel that the dough is starting to rise. It's starting to get puffy, and as such, I should be more delicate with it here. I'm still going to stretch it, but I'm definitely not going to be as rough with it because I don't want to knock all the gas out. So I just continue to grab a corner, stretch it back, grab a corner, stretch it back, and I get nice, smooth, elastic dough. When I see that it's starting to get really tight across here, that's my sign that I should let up a bit. And I'm just going to take this and flip it like that, and we'll come back in 30 minutes. See you then. All right, it's been 30 minutes. We're going to turn this again. And I think we're at the 2.5 hour mark at this point. What a lovely tub of dough. All right, same as before. Wet our hands. We're going to be a little bit more gentle this time because the dough is getting very poofy. I don't know if you can see it, but it definitely feels more delicate. And that's because it's full of gas. And that is the starter doing its job. So we're going to try and get a little bit longer stretches, but maybe less aggressive. And that's probably enough. So we take this, we flip it over, and let it sit for another 30 minutes. See you then. Okay, 30 minutes and we are at the 3-hour mark. At this point, this is fairly floofy dough. Oh yeah. Okay, so we're gently going to get some stretches in. The dough has more volume than when I first started. Again, that's the gas inside. And just going to pry up each corner, make sure it's not stuck, and then flip it over. We'll be back in 30 minutes. We are at 3.5 hours. And at this point, our dough is really, it's still very sticky, but it is quite floofy. I'm probably not going to push this for another turn. Well, I'm going to do a turn, but I'm going to do a turn in order to get it out of the tub. So just like before, I'm going to wet my hands and I'm going to do the same turns. And oh, this dough is really, really, really airy at this point. And what I'm trying to do here is get it into a ball. And I'm going to flip it over. Clean off the surface a bit. And I'm going to flour my surface. I kind of suck at this. It's a skill I have not mastered. And let's get that ball out. All right, so we have a big gelatinous mess at this point. I'm going to put some more AP flour on the top. Generous, actually. At this point, I'm just going to take my dough knife and I'm going to stick it under and move it around. And what I'm doing is I'm tightening up the top surface. Not a lot, but enough. And there is your dough for the moment. And this is a bench rest. So we're just going to cover it up and we're going to leave it here for about half an hour. And we'll come back and take a look at it and maybe put it into its final shape. All right, it's been 30 minutes and we've been doing bench rest, literally resting on the bench for 30 minutes. And we're going to take a look. So I'm not super happy with this. The dough has spread out some. These corners in particular are kind of flat against the edge. The dough is not quite holding its shape, but that's okay. This is a common thing and it's correctable. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a little more AP flour, and we are going to basically do another stretch and fold, but we're going to do it on the bench. So I'm going to pry this up with my dough knife. This is why you need a dough knife. I'm going to flip this over, and this will expose the kind of wet, sticky side underneath. And we're just going to do what's called the envelope fold. And so we're going to stretch this down a little bit and fold this up by about a third. I'm going to pull this side out by about a third. I'm going to pull the side out by about a third. And then we're going to take this and we're going to fold it over like that. And then we're going to put the seam like that and just try and tuck all the seams underneath. Okay, now we can use our dough knife again. And this is kind of a skill to learn, but you're just kind of trying to tuck the bottoms underneath as much as you can and just tighten that up. And I'm going to give it a little more flour on top. And then we're going to put this cloth back on top and we're going to do another 30-minute bench rest. See you then. All right, I think we're about 4.5 hours in, if I've done my math right. And we've just completed the second bench rest. So this is somewhat improved. It's not perfect. Ideally, the edges would be a little more bull-nosed, but as we're 4.5 hours in, I'm gonna move to the next phase at this point. So we're gonna do the same thing we did last time. we're going to do the envelope fold, but this time we're going to actually put it into the broad form. Now, this is going to need to be floured before we put it in, as is the loaf itself. I'm going to start, and I like rice flour for this. You can use AP flour, but rice flour on this final flouring process does help keep the dough from sticking to the basket. All right, so I'm just going to put some in, and I'm going to work it around the basket. We're going to flip it over again to the wet side, and we're going to do the same envelope routine. Stretch in thirds and fold it over and bring this way over the top, and like that. And I'm going to keep a kind of a cylindrical form this time, since I'm putting it into an oval banneton. And we'll put some rice flour on this, and you really need probably a lot of rice flour for this step. You really don't want it to stick to the basket. Disasters will happen. And I'm going to put a little more in the basket just for fun. All right, so now I want to put this seam side up in the basket. So this surface is going to be down in the basket. And we drop that in like so. And I'm just going to give it a little hand fitting in right. And I'm going to give it some more flour. And I'm going to put some flour on the edges. Okay, this loaf is going to go into the refrigerator overnight. It's the middle of the afternoon here right now. I'm going to bake this in the morning, so that's probably a good 18 hours or so that it's going to sit in the refrigerator. Wrap it up like so, and put it into the fridge, and we'll see you in the morning. Okay, so it's now the next morning. This loaf stayed in the fridge for around 18 hours. It was not actually rising as much as I had hoped in the fridge, so I took it out, and it's been at room temperature for the last few hours. And it has, in fact, crested the basket. It looks pretty lovely. This is going to be ready to bake pretty soon here, and so it's time to start getting the oven ready. So we need to preheat the oven, and in addition to the oven, we actually need to preheat the large combo cooker, the cast iron vessel that we're going to be cooking this in. They both need to be preheated to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's put these in, and we're going to put each piece in separately so that we can grab them individually. You'll see why later. And we're also going to put a pizza stone down below. Now this is going to keep the bottom of the bread from burning later on when we're actually cooking the bread. But let's close this up. We will go ahead and set the oven for 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And we will also set a timer for 30 minutes. Now the oven will only take about 15 minutes to get up to 500 degrees, but I want to make sure that the cast iron is fully heated to 500 degrees, so we'll give it some extra time. And we'll see you in half an hour. The oven has hit 500 degrees and it's been 30 minutes. The timer just went off a few seconds ago. So let's move on to the next step. So let's take a moment to talk about the dough. It is in the banneton or proofing basket. It has risen about as much as it is going to. It has crested the top of it. It does pass the poke test, although I've never really put much stock in that. And the skin, the outer skin of the dough is in fact dry at this point. It is not sticky anymore. It is dried out in the refrigerator, and that's going to help us when we slash it later. Here we have the skillet. I'm going to take the bread in this hand. I'm going to turn the skillet upside down, press this in, flip it upside down, and voila, the loaf is in the pan. I'm going to take my lamb and I'm going to score it, and this is going to allow the bread to expand in the oven while it's cooking. That's a really important part of this particular kind of loaf. And with one quick motion, I put a slash in it. Actually going to undercut that just a little bit more, and that's good. All right. Take out the saucepan and put them together. I'm going to set this to 450 degrees. Okay, and now into the oven for 25 minutes covered, and then we'll come back and we'll take off the cover and cook it a little bit more to get it brown. One additional detail I wanted to talk about is the pizza stone underneath. The pizza stone, when the oven is closed, will be exactly underneath the cast iron pan, and that, because it's on a lower shelf and it has an air gap, that's going to create a heat shield, and that's going to keep the bottom of the bread from burning, which helps quite a bit. Okay, it's been 25 minutes. The timer's just gone off. This will be the big reveal, the first time we've seen the loaf. There won't be any more rise after this, but there will be some further darkening, so it'll still be a little bit on the pale side. And that is a lovely pale loaf. So let's put this back in the oven for another between 10 and 15 minutes. I'm going to call it 12. That usually works in my oven. Your oven may vary. All right, 12 minutes is up, and actually I've given it another minute just for a little more darkness. Time to pull it. And there we have our finished loaf in all its glory. All right, so let's look at our loaf. It's very hot, but it does have a nice sound when we knock it on the bottom. We have here along the top, we have the fissure from where we slashed the bread. The slashing is a really important part. That's going to give the bread a place to expand to. If we didn't give it that slash, it would either rupture somewhat randomly, or worse, the outer crust would harden before the bread was done expanding, and you would end up with a very tight crumb instead of the open, airy crumb that an artisan sourdough typically has. We also have ears along the side. That's these little pointy bits. They could be a little bit darker. We have good color. I could go a little bit darker than this, but this is pretty good. We have some nice blistering along the skin, also very good. We have some of the shape of the oval proofing basket that we started with, but it did spread out a little bit to the form of the pan that we cooked it in. That's an indication that the dough probably could have been worked a little bit more than I did, but overall I'm very happy with this. It has good height. It's a good looking loaf. Now, I know what you're saying. Cut it open already. We want to see the inside. But let's wait for a bit. If we cut open the bread at this point, it's really not done cooking yet. It's still hot and still cooking inside. And if we cut it open at this point, it'll end up not keeping as well. It'll go stale faster. If you're going to eat it all in one sitting, maybe that doesn't matter, and hot buttered bread is a treat that most people rarely get to experience. So if you really can't control yourself, then go ahead and cut it open at this point. I prefer to wait an hour, maybe 2 hours until it's fully baked. All right, it's time. We're going to cut it open. See how it looks. And there you have it. We have a nice crumb, and it's open, and these holes are shiny, which is actually what you're looking for, believe it or not. I'm going to taste some. Now, I actually like the ends. It's kind of my benchmark for flavor, and I like to try it with nothing on it. Just straight up. No, that doesn't suck. I'm just going to take this with me. Thanks all.